This can be realized by inquiry, investigating the non-negativity which accompanies the sense of I. Sutra 16 left us with realization of the Supreme Self. And this is pure awareness, which is not involved in the cognitive process. It's not involved in cognitive discriminations. Now, Sutras 17 to 20 seem to have quite a variety of interpretations. But one thing they have in common is that they seem to assume that Patanjali is talking about different kinds of samadhi. He doesn't say this though. He doesn't talk about different categories of samadhi. Back in Sutra 5, he talked about the fivefold structure of the vrittis, and then went on to clearly describe them. And you think if he was talking about different samadhis, whether it's 2 or 5 or whatever, he would say how many there were and clearly describe them. But he doesn't. He hardly mentions the word samadhi. I think I'll take this opportunity to say something about my approach here to this commentary on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. I've looked at a few translations, and what strikes me is how clunky they are, especially those which are done by those with a good knowledge of Sanskrit. In attempting to get the precise meaning of the Sanskrit, the rendered English is very, very clunky. And you might say, well, this is the nature of English, isn't it? English is not suited to talking about such matters the way Sanskrit is. That may be true. But on the other hand, the clue to translating and understanding the Yoga Sutras isn't simply about knowing your Sanskrit. We have to take each sutra in context. The sutras are normally numbered from 1 up to 198, I think it is. And the danger of just trying to get an accurate Sanskrit translation means that you're not really looking at it in context. There's an almost forensic analysis which goes on, which is fine as long as that's just part of the story. We need to look at the context. We need to look at the sutra which comes before, and as much as possible attempt a holistic view of Patanjali's vision. So the first factor is getting the Sanskrit translation as accurate as possible. The second aspect is putting it into the holistic concept of Patanjali's vision, which is one of Samadhi. And thirdly, we must relate it to our own spiritual practice. If we don't do that, then it's just an academic exercise. We have to be able to relate to what Patanjali is talking about. We need to be able to see what he's talking about. It has to be useful as well. This is not an academic work. This is a work directing us to Samadhi, directing us to realization of the Supreme Self. And we don't need to talk about different kinds of Samadhi, and there's no reason. Not at this point anyway. There is only one Samadhi. Yoga begins and ends with Samadhi. And you might think, well, is the Samadhi that it ends with the same as the one it begins with? It's exactly the same. It's a bit like being pregnant. You're either pregnant or not pregnant. There are no stages in between. You're either pregnant or not pregnant. Now there's different stages to the pregnancy, of course. That's another matter. So the difference between Samadhi as the goal and Samadhi as the starting point is simply a matter of how well established you're in it. There is no difference in the Samadhi itself. So, Sutra 17 follows on from Sutra 16, which is about realization of the self. So you have to have had realization of the self already. You must have stumbled on it already. Realization of the self does not come through practice. It's something which either happens or doesn't happen. And then once it happens, that's when spiritual practice, enlightenment practice, yoga begins. And here in Sutra 17, Patanjali is telling us how it can be realized. And he's basically describing in this sutra what is known as self-inquiry. It's a teaching associated with the great sage Ramana Maharshi, who lived in the south of India in the middle of the 20th century. And his form of the teaching began with asking yourself the question, who am I? That exact question, who am I? This is the reflection. You reflect upon this. But after reflecting upon it, you observe this sensation of I directly. You get in touch with this sensation of I. This is the path to realization of the self. Now, I've used the expression non-negativity here, and I've used this as a translation of the word ananda, which is usually translated as bliss. Now, this word bliss is usually understood as an emotion. And ananda is not an emotion. It's associated with the teaching of Sat-chit-ananda, which tells us that our essential being, our essential consciousness is blissful, in which case we should all be walking around with big happy grins on our face. This is a very crass understanding, which is why I've used the term non-negativity, because we can't really apply these terms positive and negative, happy and unhappy, blissful or non-blissful to consciousness. But what we can explore is any limitation that we've got in our sense of I. Any feeling tone or any thought which actually limits this sense of I. This is what we can explore in our direct inquiry. So really what we're looking for in that sense of self is why it's not blissful. What clouds are there, and can we see beyond these clouds? Can we see beyond these clouds to this supremely non-negative state, to our supremely non-negative consciousness? And then we abide in that, or we come back to it as often as we can. Now the next sutra, Sutra 18, picks up from this. It picks up from our situation. Once we are abiding in the self, there are reasons why we don't continue abiding in the self. And these are down to our basic psychological tendencies or drives. Going deeper, beyond notional thinking, the underlying challenge of the psychological tendencies remains. I'll cover this one in the next video.